Let's begin with a question that I don't even know if you have an answer for, but have you ever had a scary encounter with an animal?
Snake.
What happened?
It was a copperhead snake in Arkansas. I stepped on it.
Really?
Full on.
You stepped on it.
Yeah.
Didn't bite you, obviously, because you're here. You killed it.
I looked down, I grabbed it, no, I'm just kidding, but I saw it and I freaked out and I just went, shoo!
You and Jesus crushing the head of the serpent.
That's it.
David?
Just a dog is all I can think of.
Okay.
At various times that, a dog's chasing. I used to run a lot and dogs would chase you and that's always a little heady, but not like a wild animal.
Definitely with a dog, but the scariest encounter I ever had with an animal was when I was riding. I wasn't riding fast, but I was on a horse bareback, and the horse was walking in circles, and I just slipped off and fell on the ground. It was really scary.
That is
really
scary.
That's it. So you just slipped off of a horse.
Bareback. It was bareback.
That's
It was
bad,
walking
bro. What
in
do you mean
circles,
that's it?
And it's funny because it took a while to slip off, and so I had all of that anticipating time, where I knew I was going to get off.
I'm gonna
go off, and maybe he'll tread me underfoot. I don't know.
I was going to say that the scariest encounter I had was when
He always does this just to show us up. He's going to have some epic
He's going to be like a
thing.
mosquito. A mosquito
I don't have
got
an
me.
epic story. I do not have an epic story.
Okay.
But James knows because James
was
was in the same area. We lived out in the wilderness.
You know all these
quite
stories.
a long time.
He's like, yeah, I know
And
this story.
I
It's the
encountered
bear.
a bear one time, and the guy I was with, I'm a city kid. I was raised in the city, and living in the country was kind of scary for the first few years. And the people we were around, they were real country folk. This guy saw the bear, I saw the bear, and my inclination is you run from the bear. You turn around, you go the opposite direction. This guy picked up a big PVC pipe and began running after it and poking it and ran it up a tree. That was scary.
That's a real
So
man
I was
right
going to
there.
say that was my scariest experience with a wild animal until James mentioned the horse, and then I remembered that I got on the back of a pony one time, and the pony didn't like me and just took off at breakneck speed, galloping until I fell off. That was the scariest experience I've ever had with an animal.
I love that.
And you're thinking, I decided at that point I would never get on the back of anything with a brain again. I can handle a car, a motorcycle, but if it has a brain, why would you get on the back of something that can make choices?
Like, I'm going to run as fast as I can until this thing falls off of me.
Yeah, exactly.
You obviously didn't get too hurt.
No, but it was definitely terrifying because I didn't
I
have
can see
control
how that would
over
be
it. And I was
terrifying.
shouting, screaming, doing what you see in cowboy movies with my legs trying to get it to stop. Said everything from yeehaw to whatever.
I think yeehaw means go really fast and pony.
So according to Revelation 13, we're all going to have a scary encounter with some kind of wild animal.
That's the
Okay,
point.
there's the tie-in.
Whoa,
There's
he
the
fully
tie-in.
That's
just
the point.
tied it
So go
in
there.
before you.
Yeah, no, that's great because in Revelation
Thank you
chapter
for that,
13,
by the way.
in Revelation 13, the whole world has a scary encounter with a wild animal that nobody's ever encountered in real life because it's a composite beast.
Yes.
But this animal in Revelation chapter 13 is described as having 7 heads, 10 horns, with the name blasphemy on its heads. And then in verse 2, this beast is a combination of a leopard, a bear, a lion, and a dragon.
Wow.
So this is quite a creature.
It's an amalgamation.
It's an amalgamation of beasts, but Revelation 13 is bringing to view not a crazy cartoonish composite beast, but a picture of a power, a kingdom, an empire, some kind of earthly system that is threatening the human race. So the first question I would have on the basis of the first 2 verses of Revelation chapter 13 is, what is the background that we're coming from on this?
Well, this stuff sounds familiar. The imagery here is taken from the book of Daniel, chapter 7.
Okay,
Should we read that?
sure.
Can I? You're looking at me funny.
Yes.
Well,
read it.
David is pointing out to me that we didn't finish chapter 12 and we're going to deal with verses 13 to 17. And
You need to connect that first?
Well, we don't need to connect it first, but
it.
we do need to come back.
Yeah, that's
to,
right.
to
It's
those
fine to come
verses.
back to it, but we just can't.
But take us to Daniel.
But we'll be going to
Daniel
that.
7.
We'll be going to that in verse 11. of Revelation
Yeah, the
13.
simple point is just
That's where
that
we're making that connection.
the amalgamation, the composite beast here in verse 2.
The what?
The composite beast.
Sorry, the composite beast is taken from Daniel 7, and there's 4 beasts. In verse 3 and verse
Yes.
4, it starts describing it first as a lion, eagle's wings. Then there's a bear.
Probably 5.
in
Raised
verse
up on one
5.
side,
Yeah.
3
Then
ribs
there's
in
a
its mouth.
leopard in verse
Verse
6, and
and
a
then
great.
there's-
Yeah.
Terrible
Okay, but
beast in
tell
verse
us,
7.
break that down
So
for us,
in Daniel
Jeffrey.
chapter 7, these beasts are describing empires. And we're told in, what is it, verse 17 and 23, is it, or
Yes,
21?
23.
That a beast represents a power
And a kingdom.
in a kingdom.
Okay.
So these are 4 powers, 4 kingdoms, and in the prophecies of Daniel, they represent the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, Greece, and the Roman Empire. So whatever we're looking at here in the 13th chapter
of Revelation.
of Revelation, Daniel, borrowing imagery from Daniel, John in Revelation 13 is trying to draw our attention to this development in history.
But he's doing something unique because he's bringing these separate empires that ran one after another, Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, and then Rome. Then he's taking those beasts that represented those powers and he's pulling them all together into one beast. Why is that? Why
That's because-
combine the elements of these different empires into one?
That's because of verse 12 of Daniel 7. It says, as concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. And what that's inferring here is that these kingdoms, Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, and Rome, had a culture and traditions and practices that carried on into this composite beast in Revelation 13. So we're going to see characteristics in this beast in Revelation 13, this earthly power in Revelation 13, that reminds us of these different powers that went before, these different kingdoms that went before it.
Yeah.
For example, like the first one that's mentioned there, Babylon, is expressly named in the book of Revelation when we get a little bit later. Well, actually, Revelation 14, Revelation 17. So the idea that you have elements of Babylonian ideas, theology, and that you have Greek ideas in there, and you have Roman ideas, that's all wrapped up with this
the
beast.
customs, the cultures.
Yeah.
And something that I've always found really persuasive is that when Daniel, who's living 600 years before the time of Jesus, when he sees this prophecy of these beasts that Jeffrey's describing in Daniel 7, he sees a lion, Babylon, a bear, Persia, Medo Persia, he sees a leopard, Greece, and then he sees this terrible, ferocious beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, Rome. So he's looking forward, as you would expect, 600 years before the time of Jesus, looking forward, he sees Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, Rome. When John, who's living first century...
And 10 horns.
And 10 horns. When John, who's living first century, describes the beast, fascinatingly, this is a great little historicist evidence, he describes those beasts in the reverse order.
Yes.
He describes the
horns
attributes
first.
of the beast. So he says that he had the 10 horns. And then he says the beast which I saw was
Leopard.
was like a leopard.
Yep.
His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth was like the mouth of a lion.
Exactly backwards.
So it's just, which makes sense. If Daniel's looking
He's positioning
forward, he
it
sees Babylon,
historically.
Medo Persia, Greece, Rome.
Yeah.
John's living during the time of Rome, so he sees Rome, Greece,
Yes.
Medo Persia,
Yes.
Babylon.
He's going backwards.
So this is just another little snippet, a little gem of this historicist idea that this is traversing through history from the time of the prophet.
Okay, so in Daniel chapter 7, we have Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, and Rome, and then there's a transition because the terrible beast in Daniel 7, which is Rome, then has a little horn that develops out of it in chapter 7, and in chapter 8 we have the little horn. So there's a transition between the pagan Roman Empire and the papal Roman Empire. So the papacy is born out of the Roman Empire. When we come to
When we say papal
Revelation,
and papacy, we're saying the medieval church.
the medieval church.
The church, like you were saying in Revelation 12, the visible, somebody's like, hey, where's the church? And that's this thing right here, because God's church has gone underground. We'll return to that, I think. So that's just so we're clear on our language here, because a lot of people might not know papacy.
Right.
That's in-house language.
So
We're
we
the
can-
medieval church.
Yeah, we
church.
can make it clear by saying that the Roman Empire has 2 phases. It has the pagan phase under the Caesars.
Yeah.
It has the papal phase under the popes.
Yeah.
And there's a transition, but it's really in Daniel's visions, it's a single empire. That's
right.
It's one empire.
Seamless transition.
It's a seamless transition, and what takes place is that the pagan Roman Empire, or secular Rome, you might even say, with religious elements from paganism, as a civil power, transitions at a certain point in history so that the Roman Empire takes on now Christian language and attributes, And the papal Roman Empire now is in the position that was once occupied by the pagan Roman Empire, or in the position of the Caesars.
And we saw that in the seven churches with Pergamos, the Constantinian era, and that morphed into Thyatira, and we saw Jezebel, but the Dark Ages, and then out of that came the Reformation. So that was covered in our seven churches.
So before I lose the point, though, that I was going for, before
Yeah.
we fleshed that out, the point I was going to make, and see if you guys feel this, if you see this, in Daniel, the fourth beast is the Roman Empire, and the little horn is the papal Roman Empire, right? Okay, when we come to Revelation 13, there's no little horn. The composite beast is what for Daniel was the little horn.
Right.
Is that making sense?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so the composite beast in Revelation chapter 13 is the Roman Empire in the papal phase.
And we know that because of the characteristics are
That's right, I was
basically
gonna say.
mirrored. In chapter 13,
Yes,
there's a
yes.
time frame given, 42
Yep.
months in verse 5.
Right?
That's the same allotted time that we've been discussing, 1,260 days. And when you read in Daniel 7, and in verse 25, you have a time frame there again that matches
Time
this
sign,
time
half a
frame.
time.
Revelation 13 says that one characteristic is blasphemy.
Yes.
We have the same thing in Daniel chapter 7 again.
Yeah.
We have persecuting power in Revelation 13. We have the same thing in Daniel chapter 7 with this little horn. So in other words, it's the same. It's the same power.
The little horn in Daniel
Yeah.
and the composite beast in Revelation 13 are one and the same
That's
power.
it. That's it.
And as we've mentioned before, what John is doing in the book of Revelation is he's borrowing from the Old Testament. So when he uses the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the 7 heads and the 10 horns, he's saying, hey, pay attention. This is that whole Daniel thing. I'm talking about that.
That's it.
So any first century Jewish reader would have been like, oh, this is Daniel stuff. Go back, figure out where you're at, and that's us now.
Yeah.
So we just know it's like a great big arrow. It's a signpost. Know Daniel.
Yeah.
Know
now,
what's going
now
on.
a crucial point that James already made, but I want to emphasize now that we've identified the first beast as the Roman Empire in the papal phase. The crucial point James was making is that the reason it's a composite beast is because that beast or that power is a conglomeration of cultural, ideological, philosophical, theological perspectives and ideas that come from Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. In other words, medieval Christianity is not the Christianity that came from Jesus and the apostles. Medieval Christianity is a pagan system
Absolutely.
that is merely borrowing some language from Christianity. But if you examine the thing itself, the papal Roman system, if you examine it, you will find that philosophically and theologically it's mostly Greek, but with
that's right.
Christian language. You will find that in practice that it's mostly Babylonian ceremonies that are being enacted and Roman ceremonies that are being enacted. So this
Even
is a,
the titles overlap, don't
This is
they?
a crucial point. That is this a good place to loop back to the last verses of chapter 12? Because what's happening here, and again, we've made this point, but I think it's just this for me answers one of the great mysteries of history. Because our world today is increasingly more and more secular, more and more atheistic, on the premise of what Christianity, quote unquote, did down through the Middle Ages. But this really is quite interesting because we're realizing now that the thing that the world is reacting against and rejecting really isn't the thing that Jesus and the apostles started.
It's the
at
residue
all.
of other pagan
So you got,
empires.
if you can imagine two parallel
Residue, that's a good word.
yeah, two parallel horizontal lines. And the upper horizontal line
Remnant.
is the church. And the lower horizontal line is the church in the wilderness, or the church being persecuted and pushed into obscurity, and it's gone underground. The thing that the world calls Christianity, and nearly all the history books, is not Christianity at all.
In terms of history, you're exactly correct.
So increasingly when somebody asks me, are you a Christian? I pause because I want to know, well, what
What
do
do
you
you mean?
mean by that? Do you mean,
Absolutely.
am I a Christian in the imperial Rome sense, in the Constantinian sense, am I a Christian in the sense of the Crusades? No.
No.
Am I a follower of Jesus?
Yes.
Yes.
But there's a lot of people that don't make the distinction. So
That's right. But
and
this
the idea that
prophecy
there
wants
is
that distinction to be made.
Of course, and the idea that there is a distinction would strike a lot of moderns as strange. Right? I mean, as that there would be a divorce, which is a fascinating word, between Christianity and Christ. I say it's a fascinating word because Paul uses that word to describe this very thing in 2 Thessalonians, which we're not going into right now, but that there is a disconnect.
The world says, I love Jesus, but I hate Christians. Basically.
That's right.
That's the...
Because the paints that have been used to paint Christianity are the paints of the historical career of Christianity through the medieval period, which is persecution, manipulation, coercion, what amounts to money laundering. I mean, it's an ugly portrait, and it does not bear any resemblance
to Jesus.
to the church that Jesus established or to Jesus himself.
We have a popular bumper sticker that I've seen around town here in Eugene, Oregon. It's very insightful. It says, Jesus called the other day, said he wants his religion back. There's a lot of insight in that because that bumper sticker is essentially realizing that there's Jesus, and then Jesus' religion has been co-opted. It's been hijacked. It's like there's this plane called Christianity, and somebody's in the cockpit running the thing.
And it's not Jesus.
And it's not Jesus.
It's not Jesus.
But it's called Christianity because if you think about it, right now we're entering an election season. And you see the candidates want to lay claim to the Christian vote. So in laying claim to the Christian vote, they're lining themselves up with what they think Christians want to hear. And some of the things that Christians want to hear are not the kinds of things that are in the teachings of Jesus.
Preach that.
Christians in the Jesus and the apostolic sense aren't about building up a military. And yet Christianity has been increasingly, in American politics, identified with military strength.
And the politicizing of Christianity is one of the characteristics that we're given for this
Say that
system.
again. The what?
The politicizing.
The politicizing of Christianity is in itself one of the characteristics that we're given to identify, to distinguish. The
Somebody
Jesus
recently
thing from
asked
the
me,
non-Jesus
is
thing.
Jesus a Republican or a Democrat?
Yeah.
And for some people, there's just an assumption that he's one or the other. I said he's neither. He doesn't identify with any political party. Jesus is above all of that with a totally different kind of kingdom. And his church was established as a church with a message that reaches the heart, not as a civil system that forces the conscience.
You know, I'd like
and
to-
that's what this
sir.
is getting at.
I'd like to touch on this a little bit
Love
more.
that.
We're out of time, but there's a point here that I think we could really flesh out and get somewhere with. Just to confirm everything we've just said, it says, in verse 2, it says, and the dragon gave him his power, his seat, and great authority. And I think it would be very, very much worthwhile for us and those listening, for us to go through the text of Revelation 13 and even spill in back to 12 and into the last part of this that we're not hitting, before we even identify the verses, and just look at the characteristics of the dragon. The characteristics.
Okay.
For example, I'll give you an example. One of the characteristics that we could look at is in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 11, it says that the dragon is an accuser. Because we're talking here about the principles of Christianity, true Christianity and false Christianity, and the layers.
Yeah.
And many times we think about that in relation to doctrines, which are significant and important. Doctrines are important, but underlying the doctrines, when we look at the culture and the philosophy of Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome, and how it's trickled into the Christian church today, we want to look at it in the sense of character. What kind of characteristics has the dragon bequeathed to this church, and how does that contrast with the characteristics of the Lamb?
Right.
There's a verse here, verse 10, for example, it talks about going into captivity and being led into captivity and killing with the sword and being killed by the sword. There are other characteristics that are identifying the spirit of the dragon. And I think it would be very helpful, because then our viewers and each one of us can say, you know what, the real issue here is not just doctrine and what we're teaching. The real issue is the character of the Lamb and the character of the dragon.
Yeah,
The spirit of the Lamb
Yeah.
and the spirit of the dragon.
So let's do that. As you mentioned, we have to take a break, and then when we come back, let's just systematically move through the passage.
Sounds good.
Hi, I'm Ty Gibson. Welcome to Digma.com. I am so excited about this website because you're about to discover a powerful new way to share life-transforming messages and videos with your family, friends, and anybody else on the planet who has access to a computer. Digma is a Greek word. It basically means to show or to reveal something by means of a pattern or an example of some kind. It's the second half of the word paradigma, from which we get the English word paradigm, as in paradigm shift. And so what you're going to find at Digma.com is a growing library of short videos and transcripts dealing with paradigms and fundamental questions. What's the meaning of life? What is our origin and destiny as human beings? What happens when we die? Does God exist, or are we alone in this vast universe? And why is there so much evil and suffering in our world? An estimated 70% of Americans have a computer right in their home and stay in touch with family and friends by email. And more than 400 million people are active on Facebook. And 5 million new users are signing up every week. We are literally in the midst of a communications revolution of massive proportion. This is granting the gospel direct and easy access to millions upon millions of homes and hearts. And that's what Digma.com is all about. It's a tool for leading our family and friends on an exciting paradigm shift by revealing the truth of God's creative power and His incredibly beautiful character in contrast to our world's popular misconceptions about who God is.
James, before the break, you said essentially, let's begin to systematically walk through the passage. We did verses 1 and 2. And what we did in verses 1 and 2 of Revelation 13 is we identified the beast.
Yes.
The beast from the sea, the composite beast, is equivalent to Daniel's little horn power. It's the Roman Empire, papal phase, the medieval church. We've identified that. But when we come to verse 3, it says, I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed,
Yes.
and all the world marveled, or another version says wondered after the beast and followed the beast. So if this is the medieval church, if this is the Roman Empire at the papal phase, we're being told in Bible prophecy here that system will in some sense be wounded, but then that wound will be healed. Is there historical evidence that the papal Roman Empire, that the medieval church was in fact in some sense wounded and then healed? Does that
Somebody
fit
else can
with
talk about
history?
the healing, but the wounding again traces back to chapter 11,
Yes.
where we read that there would be this power that would rise up, and we
Okay.
identify that as the French Revolution, right? And in that era, as this power in France rose up against Christianity, against the church because of the misrepresentation, the target was the church.
So be more specific. What exactly happened historically that wounded the church?
Well, under Napoleon, the Pope was basically unseated.
Right.
in 1798.
February 1798.
Yeah.
Birth
Now,
date.
why is the 1798 date significant? Because we never defined that 1260-year
We
period of
haven't,
time.
no. But we've been going back to it over and over because that's that period we ran into in chapter 12, 1,260 days. It's the period in chapter 11. And from the rise of this medieval system we've been talking about, 538, the year 538, that period of 1,260 years up until what we've just mentioned, 1798. So that's the period of this medieval ascendancy that we've been talking
You
about.
can even come at it backwards, and you can say, well, it says that the papal system would be wounded, and history tells us that that occurred in 1798. And if you count back from there 1,260 years,
Right.
because a day equals a year in Bible prophecy, you come to 538. You can come at it from that way and ask, well, what happened then?
No, you're onto it.
Same thing.
The,
Same thing.
the period here, we should say that.
So what did happen then? Is that what?
Well, I think we covered that. So basically, Napoleon.
No, in 538 though. What's the
Oh, gotcha.
538 date?
Well,
why
it does take a little
538?
bit
The
of.
Pope
okay.
is granted civil authority. It's
That's
not
it.
just ecclesiastical power. He's
Okay,
granted
now we're getting at
civil
it.
power.
So we have two bookends. We have 538, 1798. This is the point that I think we need to make clear, is that 1,260-year period of time begins in 538 with the papacy being granted full-fledged civil authority.
Church and state unite.
Church and state unite.
Let me just say a word about that, just to set a larger historical context for our listeners and for us. Remember that what's happened is you have Christianity, you have the ascension of Jesus, the apostolic movement, that's ending at the end of the first century, so say AD 100. You then have AD 200, 300, which is a period variously of some peace, some persecution, but largely where the church is sort of trending upward, right? Then you have the conversion of Constantine, AD 312, which we've talked about, the Constantinian era. From the time of Constantine, who was the first of the Roman Christian emperors, it's only a very short period relatively to the demise of the Roman Empire, AD 476. You go from 312 to 476, like 160 years. So this is like the last gasp of Rome in its pagan phase. By the time we get to AD 476, with the dissolution of Rome, the fragmenting of the Western Roman Empire, now the big question is okay, what is the unifying force?
What's going to fill the vacuum?
What keeps
What's the
Rome?
glue?
What keeps it? And the not homogenizing, the adhering,
Come on, flesh it out.
gluing
Flesh it out.
property. The thing that made Rome unified in any sense was not now a political or a strong federal government. It was the church. So you start looking to church leaders for various ecclesiastical
to fill the
positions.
civil vacuum.
So if you go from AD 476 to AD 538, that's just a very short period of confusion and, hey, who's in charge here? And there is a story there. The story goes back to after the conversion of Constantine in AD 312. In AD 330, he moves the seat of the Western Roman Empire from Rome to what we call Istanbul, but Constantinople, literally city of Constantine. And he more or less leaves the Bishop of Rome kind of in charge of not just the churches, but hey, you sort of oversee things here. So there was already a trajectory for the Bishop of Rome to be viewed as a significant figure in a civil sense. After the demise of Rome in AD 476, he rises into that position naturally. And by the time we get to AD 538, you're saying the tarmac, so to speak, is cleared. All those other flights have gone. There's nothing now preventing the rise of the papal Roman Empire,
and
or
even the
medieval
titles
church.
just get handed off, grandfather, like Pontifex
So I don't know if I did a good
Maximus
job
and
there,
things
but I'm
like
just
You did
trying
an
to
excellent
trying
job.
to paint
Yeah.
how did we get here.
Yeah. So 538, as Jeffrey was pointing out, you just gave the background. 538 is that point in history when the papal church begins to occupy civil position.
Officially.
Officially.
It already had that
538.
inclination from the Constantinian
right.
time, but yeah, now it's like, hey, the road is clear, and there's no other.
And it's just handed over.
You got it, exactly.
So 538, and then you count forward 1,260 years, which this prophecy is mentioned repeatedly.
7 times in Scripture.
7 times. That 1,260-year period, if you count forward, you come to 1798, from 538 to 1798, and that's where
Which is
you were pointing out that Napoleon French Revolution, takes the Pope captive off the papal throne, puts him in exile. He dies in exile, the Pope does, and that is the inflicting of the deadly wound that's brought to view in verse 3. But then it says the deadly wound was healed. So what's with that?
Well, I think we should say that the reason Napoleon wasn't just, like, hey, what am I going to do this afternoon? I think I'll go take the Pope off of his throne. This was a pendulous response, basically where France was reacting in a very radical way against centuries of papal abuse and coercion and manipulation over all of the. Europe is now coalesced and solidified into countries like Germany, France, England. It wasn't like that going back. You had regional powers and empire, but over time, over this period of about 1,000 years, you have the rise of what's called nationalism. So before, the church was the unifying force in what we today call Europe, right? But over time, the Germans and the German language and the German borders become increasingly defined. So too with France, so too with the other nations of Europe. And this nationalism is like, hey, why do we care what this guy that sits on a throne down in Rome? We don't care about him. We care about German things. We care about French things. We care about English things. We care about Spanish things. And the country that was tipped over in the most dramatic fashion was France. And they're like, okay, Napoleon's like, I'm over it. I'm over him, I'm over the church, I'm over all this superstition. And they launched, back in Revelation 11, the French Revolution. The papacy and the Pope was a casualty of their own devices.
That's right.
They created a situation that then, like they created a Frankenstein, and then Frankenstein came and basically inflicted a deadly wound.
But verse 3 does say that eventually that deadly wound would be healed. And so now we're entering another stage.
The wound
early
was fairly
1920s.
temporary.
Yeah, that's what, and it's suggested in the text because it's abrupt.
Yeah.
And it was healed.
That same verse.
Yeah, so another political, figure steps in, and Mussolini now re-grants power to the papal system in the early 1920s, and now we have a
Late 1920s.
Resurgence. Yeah, in the 1920s.
And it's not just.
But that's not an immediate. It's healed now in 1929 by Mussolini giving back the property.
We have a process now.
Well, do you see this?
This healing is a process.
Yeah,
it's
that's right.
not. It's not a.
You see that thing on my finger?
It looks like a wound that's undergoing healing.
Good
Yeah,
fingers.
it's undergoing healing. I just sliced right into a piece of metal.
Did you have to use that word?
And the thing is when I sliced into that piece of metal, the flesh showed. It was just flesh.
This is for effect.
And here's the deal: at night when I was
Blood was
sleeping,
gushing everywhere.
it would heal over, on my knuckle. But when I would wake up in the morning, I would go like this. Oh, it would hurt, so I'd leave it like this. But inevitably you're doing stuff and you're not able to be conscious, and so it would break open again, and that went on and on and on. When we're talking about a deadly wound, we're talking about something that's much more significant than a little slice on a knuckle. We're talking about something that almost brings you to death. And so to say that wound is healed in this year or with this act or with this act, no, it doesn't work that way. It's been progressive.
Right.
It's slow. Even
Continues to this day.
Napoleon began to heal that wound.
Yeah. It's
true.
Though he did take the crown out of the Pope's hand and put it on his own head, he allowed the Pope to come into that ceremony. He allowed the Bible to again be acknowledged as a book that it doesn't have to be burned in the street. And so this healing has progressively gotten more and more to the place where it's being restored to what it once was, and we still are not living in a time when that wound has been completely healed.
We're still living in that process.
That is predicted in the rest of Revelation chapter 13. We're going to see that wound completely healed in the context of these verses.
So it's symbolic language that essentially, when it says that the papal power was wounded and the deadly wound was healed, what we're really saying, what the Bible is saying, is that the papacy was taken out of political power, but it will gradually be restored to political power.
Yeah.
That's what this language is telling us.
And it tells us this language in a really interesting way. It says that in the context of this, all the world is going to wonder. All the world is going to be amazed. All the world is going to be looking on. So here is a system that was once despised, at least in France, by a people that learned of the real inner workings of this religious atrocity. And as they looked at all this stuff that was taking place that they thought was light and good and represented God, but didn't, it was just atrocious and ugly and sick, they stood back and they overreacted, because not only did they rebel against that system, but they rebelled against the Bible.
God,
They rebelled against
Scripture.
God.
Yeah.
And that's what
So it is
we're
an
still living. We're
overreaction.
still living in that environment today. We're still living in that environment. And so then there's going to be recovery. There's going to be recovery, and people are going to forget the atrocity and the darkness and the evil and the wickedness, or even in the face or in the light of some of that wickedness, which we see taking place in relation to some of the doctrines and teachings as of eternal burning hell, or the priesthood in relation to the abuse that takes place because you're forbidden to marry and you're forbidden to marry. Even in the light of all that, people are still going to admire the leader of this system, and the system itself is going to have recognition from political powers, and so we see that being predicted in this verse. All the world is going to wonder, and they're going to say, who can make war against that power? Who can speak badly of that power? And I think really, if you analyze it, we're kind of living in that time.
Oh, certainly.
When even now, with all the history of the Dark Ages and all the history of what's happening today, even now people are thinking, no, wait a minute, this leader of this system is a great guy.
And there's a general ignorance about the past. Those
There
that
is.
don't know the past.
I wanna-
repeat
I-
it.
I'm-
And there is this whole spirit of, hey, that was a long time ago.
Yes.
Things have changed.
Yes.
Everything's
We've
fine.
apologized.
Coupled with an ignorance of the fact that it wasn't just like a few people that were killed. We're talking hundreds of thousands, millions of people killed by the church for not following the specific doctrinal and ecclesiastical dictates of the church.
And of course,
This
many
is
of
millions of
many of the
people.
actual members had nothing to do with that. We're talking leadership. We're
Of course,
talking
of course,
the
of course,
system.
of course, of course. It's a system.
It's without question the greatest crime against humanity in the history of the world. What the Christian church did to the world
In the name.
in the name of Jesus through the Middle Ages. Later on in Revelation, it summarizes this by saying that she, this power, is the mother of all the abominations of the earth. Now you can say, well, that's exaggerating for effect, or you can say, wait a minute, this thing was so diabolical that it produced all kinds of horrible political and religious and social effects.
Offshoots, yes.
Yeah, and that's what's being described in
It
the
set in
passage.
motion
But
a
I do want
domino
to clarify
effect.
something. I think you guys will agree with this. James said, people are under the impression that you're referring to the head of the system, the Pope, is a great guy. He seems to be a great guy. I would have spaghetti dinner with him. I mean, he seems like a great guy. So what we're describing and what the Bible is describing here has very little to do with any given person's personality and whether or not he's a great guy. He very well could be a great guy. He could be an honest guy. We would hope that he would be. But the passage is describing a system that this person is heading up. And so there are fundamental things that are wrong with a system that represents Christ, represents God by a marriage of civil and religious power. That's a deadly combination.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a deadly combination because
It's a beast.
It's a beast. It can only produce one of two effects. To combine religion and politics, to combine a civil power with its military and its laws with a religious power, can only produce one of two effects, either unbelief, atheism, or
That's what happened in the case with France.
or religious enslavement. But there's one thing that it can't produce. It can't produce genuine, voluntary love for God.
Or it doesn't lend itself
No,
to that.
it can only, well, there are people in the system who do love
That's
God.
what I'm saying.
But they love God in spite of the system, not because of the system.
You're onto it.
The system itself, that doctrinal system and that combination of church and state cannot produce anything but the reaction of unbelief or a slavish kind of worship.
Yeah, that's right.
And there are
But,
lots of wonderful people who do love God in the system, but again, they love God in spite of the system because they're overlooking it, because they're looking past it, because they're not thinking too long and hard about it.
But even people who are not in that system but are in other systems can still have the mentality of that system,
Including you and me.
including us.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have to take a break. Again, we don't like taking breaks, but we have to take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll see if we can finish Revelation 13. I don't know if we can.
Well, at least we can get through verse 10.
Okay.
Don't you think?
All right, let's
All
take
right,
a
we'll do our
break.
best.
Digma videos are short, engaging messages designed for opening up discussion with individuals and groups regarding the character of God, as well as for your own personal spiritual growth. For your free DVD sample collection of Digma videos, call 877-585-1111 or write to Lightbearers, 37457 Jasper Lowell Road, Jasper, Oregon, 97438. Once again, for your free DVD sample collection of Digma videos, call 877-585-1111 or write to Lightbearers, 37457 Jasper Lowell Road, Jasper, Oregon, 97438. Simply ask for Digma DVD 2.
Well, Revelation 13 is heavy. I mean, really heavy, because it requires us to look at actual history and to do some identifying of powers that have been active in history. And while we want to be sensitive, the passage is telling us something. The passage is telling us that there is a power in history that fulfilled these characteristics. But it's the system we're dealing with, not any given individual in the system.
So the Bible's not vague. The chapter's not vague. It's willing to get willing to get to the nitty-gritty, to real life.
Yeah.
So what do you think of this idea? Tell me if you like this, you might not like it. We're all Americans. So, right? American citizens. So a number of years ago, you travel, all of us travel internationally, and in the presidency, during the time, this is my experience, traveling internationally, in the time of the presidency of George Bush, not the first George Bush, but George W. Bush.
Right.
Man, it seems like almost everywhere I'd go, particularly in the wake of the Iraq War, man, people would go out of their way when they found out I was an American to be like, I do not like George Bush.
And therefore I do not like you.
And I would be like, well, he's not my uncle, he's not my dad. So here's the point. My point is this. There is a whole system that is the United States of America. There is a person at the head. Now it's Barack Obama. We're on the verge of, having a new president. But there is a giant system underneath that, so much so that the guy at the top, or girl, woman, actually could be a reasonable human being. Like you say, somebody you'd sit down with, have lunch, talk about, basketball, baseball, or whatever. But there is this giant system underneath. We're talking, the United States is a young nation, just over 200 years. The medieval church has been around, we're talking 85, 38, and even prior to that, the machinations of it are there. We're talking about a system that's been around for more than a millennium, 15 centuries, 16, 17 centuries. You've got systems that are built, systems on systems and systems on systems that are built in to that you actually could have a person at the top who could be somebody that might himself be a reasonable human being. But and certainly, let's be clear about this, whether or not he is a reasonable human being is quite beside the point.
It's beside the point.
He's somebody for whom Jesus died. He's a human being. He's somebody for whom Jesus died.
A great system can have a not so great leader at the top of it. So it's at the end of the day, it's the system, right?
So the point that I'm making here is that I would not be the least bit offended as an American if somebody's like, hey, there are things in American history that I am greatly ashamed of. In American history, the treatment of the native peoples, the indigenous peoples of the United States, the broken treaty after broken treaty after broken treaty, that is slavery. Right? These are things that you don't look back and say, I'm just so proud to be an American. You say, I don't like that. That is not who I am, even though I am an American citizen.
The principles upon which the nation was founded, you agree with, but the abuses of and the violations of those principles.
You're onto it.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be the least bit offended if somebody said to me, hey, look, I got some real reservations about America. My response would be, so do I. So do I.
Yeah.
And that may or may not be a reflection on the specific person, a Carter, a Nixon, an Obama, a Bush, that's in the White House at that moment.
Right.
So we're not talking about people and individuals, we're talking about a system.
We're talking about a system.
A nation, a power.
I like the illustration.
And really,
I think it makes a lot of sense, and it helps us to be reasonable and fair and to not. We do not subscribe to or participate in any form of hate.
And really, the original point that we were talking about,
I like that.
or at least I was talking about, is in the text. everything we're saying is in the text. The texts themselves tell us how bad this system is, so bad that it's blaspheming God, so bad that it's seeking to persecute God's people, etc. And yet at the same time the text says that all the world wonders after this system, and all the world says, who's like unto him? Who can make war with him? So what we're identifying is the two aspects of this one system. So really everything we've said just nails the coffin. It just makes it very, very clear that this is the very system that is identified in Bible prophecy.
Sure.
And we've looked at the history, of course, but the characteristics that we're outlining here perfectly match the system that is being identified.
Yeah, and that's the point.
That's the point.
That's the point.
And it's
So verse 4, you mentioned, Ty, this is heavy. Verse 4 gets super duper heavy. Notice I threw a duper on top of that. Because it says, so they worshipped the dragon. Well, we've already identified the dragon as the devil. This gets kind of dodgy.
Yeah.
So they worshipped the devil? You know, devil worship? That's really unsettling. Who gave authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, and this is, you've quoted this a couple times, James, who is like the beast, who is able to make war with him? So you have this wild idea here, the scripture's basically saying, so the dragon, who we just were introduced to in Revelation chapter 12, gave this power, his authority, and his position. And so now when people get caught up with the dragon, with this power, they're really getting caught up with this larger thing that's taking back in Revelation chapter 12 with this war that broke out in heaven.
That's right.
They're participating in a way of viewing God, in a way of viewing religion that is not Christ-like.
Yeah.
It's dragon-like.
Right. So people are unwittingly
That's the key.
worshiping the devil by their allegiance to this system that operates on the principles. Of the
Coercion,
devil. They don't.
got it.
They don't even know. Let me show you a passage where Jesus got to the heart of this in John chapter 16. I find this passage very helpful to understand the dynamic that's going on here in the Revelation 13 passage. In chapter 16 of John, starting with verse 2, Jesus is speaking, and he's projecting forward to a time of persecution. And he says, they, whoever they are, will put you out of the synagogue. Yes, the time is coming when whoever kills you will think that he offers God service. He will think that he's offering, by killing you, he will think he's doing God's service. Now here's the key. Verse 3, and these things they will do to you because they have not known the Father nor me.
That's huge.
Isn't that a powerful passage?
Misunderstanding of what God's all about in his character leads
Mm-hmm.
people to behave in ways that are totally contrary to what God is like.
But it says they think they're serving
They're
God.
convinced.
And this
With
is
violence and
this is, by the way, Jesus is right here in chapter 16. He's looping back to something, a conversation he began in chapter 8.
Look at this.
Where
I literally just
you
put
went
my
back to
thing
8?
in John 8, waiting. Yeah.
So in chapter 8, Jesus is essentially saying to a religious body of people, a group of religious leaders, he's essentially saying to them, hey, you're plotting my murder. You're about to kill me. You say that you're Abraham's seed and that you're sons of God, but the fact is that you are of your father, the devil, who's been a murderer from the beginning. So that's taking us back to this great controversy theme of Revelation chapter 12.
The idea of murder, violence, coercion.
It's kind of related to
in
what
the name of God.
In the name of God.
You remember what Jesus said, what Jesus said to Peter when Peter is approaching him and Jesus is talking about his death, and Jesus says, "Get thee behind me, Satan."
It's not like he was literally Satan.
Satan works through human beings and human systems.
That's right. He's looking past the individual to the system under which that individual is it being influenced.
And when Jesus says in John 8 there, you are of your father the devil, he's not literally saying genetically, biologically, you're the descendant. He's saying you're operating like he operates. He's a warmonger. He's violence, manipulation,
By the way,
coercion.
you mentioned earlier the passages in the Old Testament, the Satan passages.
Verses,
One of them is Ezekiel 28. And that's a passage in which one of the identifying marks of the devil is that there's violence in his heart. Yeah. Now this is before any actual violence is acted out, but Ezekiel's passage says that violence is at the root of his character, and then that violence comes out in the way he treats Jesus. The cross is the manifestation
So
of that violence.
when it says in Revelation 13, they will worship the dragon, we're not really imagining millions of people doing this in front of some pitchfork with horns.
You and I can worship the dragon if
Yeah.
we conduct ourselves in a way that is consistent with the principles of Satan's kingdom, particularly if we did it in the name of God, which, by the way, we should say that the medieval church does not have a monopoly on perverting the name of God.
That's right.
That can happen in any church. Those
has
principles,
happened.
Jesus identified it as happening in the Jewish system. Hey, you are of your father, the devil. Incidentally, that violence verse for our viewers is verse 16, filled with violence of Ezekiel 28.
Yeah.
So we should say here that the principle, there is this giant system that's been operating through history in the Christian era that has embodied and systematized, you wrote a great article on this, Ty, systematized this way of doing religion. But that doesn't mean they have a copyright on it. It doesn't mean that they're the only ones that can behave in unfortunate...
You could go so far as to say that it's in human nature.
That's what I was referring to in the article.
And that religious system using force and violence in God's name is just a corporate expression of what's going on in all of our hearts, according to the Apostle Paul in Romans 8. He says that the human heart, yours and mine, is at enmity against God and God's law. So that enmity that's in my heart, if I get together and start a religious system with you, Jeffrey, and then we baptize James, and then we baptize David, and we can make a church that is simply the corporate manifestation of our enmity against
nature.
God, but we call it serving God, like Jesus said.
So this is important because, again, in verse 4, they worship the dragon. It's subtle.
They're worshiping the dragon in principle.
Yeah.
I want to bring out another
it's
point
not,
too.
It gets trivialized.
Something
in
else
the
that
media.
David said really makes sense here too, and that is that they don't have a copyright on this. And the reason that's important is because in verse 4 again, it's talking about, or in verse 3 again, it's talking about how the whole world will wonder. Why would the whole world wonder after this religious system? Well, because they have the same principles. The beast of Revelation 13 is the corporate manifestation of individuals in whatever religion they're in, even if they're not in a religion. It's the corporate manifestation of the human
like
heart.
attracts like.
Right.
They're identifying something they're familiar with. They're saying, wait a second, that's how I roll. That's
something they've been developing and practicing. That's my MO. That's the way I am.
And
like
that's
that,
at a subconscious level usually,
like
isn't
that.
it? You don't even know why you're attracted to even a political party.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another point.
So verse 5 says that he, this power, was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. That verse should be really clear to us now because we've talked about the blasphemy thing from Daniel.
This
the
is
42
historic
months is the
identification.
1260.
Yep.
We've done that, the 538 to 1798.
Verifying
We've
again.
done a lot of the background so we can you can actually move through these fairly readily.
Just read through, David, verses 6 through 10, and let's just unpack it.
Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven.
That's Daniel 7 and 8.
That's Daniel 7 and 8. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation.
Persecution,
during
war,
the medieval
down through
period.
the Middle Ages, the church
Verse
using
8.
violence in God's name.
And all who dwell on the earth will worship him whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. That's
Talk about
giant.
the principles right there. The contrast, the principles of the Lamb likeness, the principles of other-centered, self-giving. There's the contrast between the two
this is another
ways.
lamb is showing up here. Good point.
Yes.
Or not the lamb is showing up here some 26 times in Revelation. This is a contrast. It's a war of principles. Verse 9. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. That's straight out of that. You hear that a lot in Revelation. It's like listen with discernment, listen with your heart, pray for the Spirit that you actually get what's going on here.
This is really important right here.
And then verse 10 is the climax of this section of Scripture. He who leads into captivity will go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints.
That's a crucial passage.
That is.
That is the fulcrum passage that tips us into the next beast that we'll encounter in our next session. But we've talked about the idea of the lion's den. Hey, we're going to get Daniel in there. They end up in it.
Yeah, that's good.
Hey, we're going to get this fire, and we're going to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into it, and then the people that tried to throw them in get killed. Ecclesiastes, whatever the passage was there, you dig a pit, you fall into it. You break through a wall, you get bit by a serpent.
You operate by principles of force, and that force reacts upon you. because people treat you the way you treat them.
Exactly.
That tends to be the pattern.
There's always, you think about the instability in the world today, whether you're talking instability in Europe, you're talking about instability in Africa, or even South America, coups. Hey, we can do it better than that government. And then those powers that come in operate by the same principles, and then you just wait another, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is in that particular country, another coup, another coup, another coup. And the countries, sadly, tragically, in many of these areas of the world that have stability are ones where the dictator's strong enough to squash any potential rebellion
Until
or
a stronger one
uprising.
comes up. Yeah.
But that's your point, Ty. There's nothing redemptive taking place here. There's nothing new. There's nothing novel. So when Jesus shows up and it's like, hey, we're going to do harm to you, he's like, all right, do it. It's a whole new way of doing reality. It's a whole new way of
Father,
doing leadership.
Forgive them. They
Forgive them. They don't know what they're
he's
doing.
forgiving us. There's more power in forgiveness and love than there is in force. That's the point. Final point, though, in the 30 seconds that remain, here is the patience and the faith of the saints. I don't know if you guys see this or not, but I think what that's saying is the whole world is operating by the tit for tat, violence for violence system, but the saints, they patiently endure in the face of that system by not participating in it.
Wow.
And that loops back to chapter 12 and verse 11.
We'll
they
come back
love
to
not
that.
their lives to the
Unto
point
the death.
of death.
Yes, beautiful.
So we'll just close on that note and come back and continue
Finish it
through
up.
chapter
Awesome.
13.
Amen.